I found my bags by the gate and my son blocking the door. "We're done taking care of you." So I left, without looking back. 6 months later, he was the one who needed help. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The morning light filtered through my bedroom curtains like a reluctant visitor, casting pale shadows across the hardwood floor I had polished just yesterday. I sat on the edge of my bed, smoothing down the creases in my baby pink dress, the one Jude had always said made me look dignified. The irony wasn't lost on me now, 6 months later, after the confrontation with Curtis, as I prepared for what would likely be my final conversation with my son. My hands trembled as I folded the last of my belongings into the worn leather suitcase that had traveled with me through 35 years of marriage, 2 cross-country moves, and countless family vacations. Each item carried weight beyond its physical presence: the silver hairbrush that had been my mother's, the photo of Curtis as a toddler clutching my finger, the reading glasses I'd bought just last month when my vision finally admitted defeat to time. The house felt different this morning. Not just quiet, it had been quiet for weeks, but hollow, as if it were already mourning my departure. I had lived here for 8 years, ever since Jude died, and Curtis insisted I sell the family home. "You don't need all that space, Mom," he'd said then, his voice gentle but firm. "This place is perfect for you. Close to us, manageable, safe." Safe. The word tasted bitter now as I remembered how eagerly I'd agreed, how grateful I'd been for his concern. At 62, freshly widowed and drowning in grief, I'd believed his offer of proximity meant I'd remain part of their lives. I'd imagined Sunday dinners that stretched into evening, impromptu visits from my grandchildren, holidays filled with laughter and tradition continuing. Instead, I got supervised visits scheduled around Clarice's convenience, stilted conversations that ended the moment she entered the room, and the gradual understanding that my presence had become an obligation rather than a joy. The sound of a car door slamming made my stomach clench. Through the window, I watched Curtis stride up the walkway, his face set in that expression I'd come to know so well, the one that said he was handling an unpleasant but necessary task. Behind him, Clarice remained in the passenger seat, her phone pressed to her ear, probably already moving on to more important matters. I had called him yesterday, my voice steadier than I'd felt in months. "We need to talk," I'd said simply. No tears, no pleading. I'd used up my allotment of both over the past 2 years. "About what, Mom?" "About where I go from here." The pause that followed had stretched long enough for me to hear Clarice's voice in the background, sharp and impatient. "Curtis, are you coming? We have the contractor meeting at 3. "I'll be there tomorrow morning," he'd said finally. "We'll figure something out." Figure something out. As if I were a puzzle with missing pieces, a problem requiring a practical solution. Now, listening to his footsteps on the porch, I realized I'd already figured it out. The revelation had come not in a moment of dramatic clarity, but in the slow, steady accumulation of small wounds that had finally bled enough to wake me up. It started 18 months ago, when they stopped including me in Easter plans. "We're keeping it small this year," Clarice had explained when I asked. "Just us and the kids." But I'd seen the photos on Facebook later. Clarice's parents beaming beside the children in their Easter clothes, a table set for 8. Then came the forgotten birthday calls, the Christmas gifts that arrived a week late with tags still showing the Amazon Prime tape, the gradual reduction of my role from grandmother to distant relative who sent checks on holidays. The final blow had come 3 weeks ago, during what I'd thought was a routine visit. I'd been making lunch for Warren and Angelica when Clarice appeared in my kitchen doorway, her smile sharp as winter air. "Aurora, we need to discuss something." She never called me Mom, despite 15 years of marriage to my son. "Curtis and I have been talking about your situation, my situation, as if my life were a temporary inconvenience that required management. Curtis's promotion means we'll be traveling more," she'd continued, perching on the edge of my kitchen chair like a bird preparing for flight. "And with the kids getting older, they need more supervision, more activities. It's becoming difficult to check on you as much as we'd like." I had set down the sandwich I'd been making, my hands steady despite the earthquake beginning in my chest. "I haven't asked you to check on me." "Well, of course you wouldn't ask," Clarice had laughed, a sound like ice cracking. But you're not getting any younger, Aurora. Living alone at your age. It's a responsibility for us, you know? That word again. Responsibility. Not love, not family, not the natural care that flows between generations. Responsibility. Duty without warmth, obligation without affection. We've found a lovely place, she'd continued. Sunset Manor has an excellent reputation. They have activities, medical care on site, people your own age. You'd be much happier there. My fingers had found the kitchen counter, gripping its edge like an anchor. A nursing home. An assisted living facility. Curtis had corrected from the doorway, where he'd apparently been listening. His voice carried that patient tone he used with difficult clients. Mom, it makes sense. You'd have support, socialization, security. I don't need assistance with living, I'd said quietly. I need assistance with loneliness. The silence that followed had been profound. Clarice's smile had flickered, and Curtis had looked anywhere but at me. In that moment, I'd understood with crystalline clarity that my loneliness was not a problem they intended to solve. It was a condition they expected me to manage elsewhere. Now, 3 weeks later, Curtis's knock on my door sounded exactly as I'd expected. Brisk, efficient, final. I opened the door to find him holding a manila folder, his expression carefully neutral. Behind him, Clarice had finally emerged from the car but remained at the end of the driveway, ostensibly examining her manicured nails. Mom! He stepped inside without waiting for invitation, his eyes immediately going to my packed suitcases by the door. What's all this? I told you yesterday. We're talking about where I go from here. He set the folder on my coffee table, the same table where he'd once spread homework papers and art projects, where Jude had taught him chess on rainy Saturdays. The sight of that official manila envelope resting on the polished wood felt like a small death. I've brought the paperwork for Sunset Manor, he said, settling into Jude's old chair without ceremony. The good news is they have an opening next month. You can tour it this week. I remained standing, my hands clasped behind my back. I won't be touring Sunset Manor. His eyebrows rose slightly. Mom, we discussed this. It's the practical choice. You discussed it. I listened. Something in my tone must have alerted him to the shift in dynamics, because his posture changed, became more alert. What are you saying? I walked to the window, looking out at the garden I'd cultivated over 8 years. The roses Jude had loved were blooming despite my recent neglect, their deep red petals unfurling toward the sun with stubborn optimism. I'm saying that I've made my own arrangements. The silence behind me stretched taut as a wire. When Curtis finally spoke, his voice carried a note of something I'd rarely heard from him in recent years. Uncertainty. What kind of arrangements? I turned to face him, and for a moment, I saw not the successful attorney with the perfect wife and planned life, but the boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, seeking comfort in the warmth of my presence. The kind where I decide what happens to me. Curtis's face flushed, and I recognized the flash of temper he'd inherited from his father. Mom, you're being unreasonable. I can't just what? My voice remained level, but something in it made him stop mid-sentence. I can't make decisions about my own life? I can't choose where to live, how to spend my time, who deserves my company? That's not what I meant. Isn't it? I moved closer to him, and he shifted uncomfortably in the chair. For 2 years, you and Clarice have made it clear that I'm a burden. My needs are inconvenient, my presence is unwelcome, my feelings are irrelevant. You've packaged it in concern and practical planning, but the message has been unmistakable. Mom, that's not... Let me finish. The steel in my voice surprised us both. You want me warehoused somewhere convenient, where your responsibility ends with a monthly check and a birthday card, where you can tell your friends you're taking care of your mother without actually having to see her, hear her, or remember that she once sacrificed everything to raise you. Curtis's face had gone pale. Through the window, I could see Clarice pacing by the car, checking her phone with increasing agitation. So here's what's going to happen, I continued, each word measured and deliberate. I'm leaving today. I have somewhere to go. Someone who actually values my company. You can keep your assisted living facility and your sense of duty. I'm no longer your responsibility. Where? The word came out strangled. Where are you going? I smiled then. The first genuine smile I'd felt in months. That's no longer your concern. I picked up one of my suitcases, surprised by how light it felt. Everything essential to my happiness, it seemed, didn't weigh very much at all. Curtis stood abruptly, his lawyer instincts finally kicking in. Mom, you can't just disappear. We need to know where you are. What if something happens? I paused at the door, my hand on the handle. Something did happen, Curtis. I remembered that I raised a son who was supposed to love me, not manage me. The door closed behind me with a soft click, final as a period at the end of a long, painful sentence. Clarice looked up from her phone as I loaded my suitcases into my car, her expression shifting from irritation to confusion to something that might have been alarm. Aurora, where are you going? She called out, her voice pitched higher than usual. I started my engine without answering. In my rearview mirror, I watched Curtis emerge from the house, the manila folder still in his hand, his mouth moving in words I could no longer hear. As I drove away from the life they'd planned for me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the exhilarating terror of an uncertain future that was entirely my own to write. The GPS voice guided me through streets I hadn't seen in 15 years, past neighborhoods that had transformed from rural farmland into sprawling subdivisions. But the old highway remained unchanged, 2 lanes of cracked asphalt threading between oak trees that had witnessed decades of my life passing beneath their branches. My destination lay 40 miles from Curtis's carefully planned vision of my future, in a town where I'd once been someone other than a burden or a responsibility. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was driving toward my past to reclaim my future. The phone on my passenger seat had been buzzing incessantly since I'd left the house. Curtis's name flashed across the screen with increasing desperation, but I'd learned something profound in the last hour. I didn't have to answer just because someone called. Millbrook appeared around a bend in the road like a watercolor painting left in the sun too long, faded but still recognizably beautiful. The main street stretched before me, lined with Victorian houses that had been converted into antique shops, a coffee house with mismatched chairs on the porch, and Murphy's Hardware, where I'd once bought paint for Warren's nursery when Curtis was stationed overseas. I parked in front of the old library, its red brick facade exactly as I remembered. My hands shook as I turned off the engine, not from fear, but from the strange sensation of returning to a place where I'd once mattered. The woman behind the circulation desk looked up as I entered, her silver hair caught in afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows. Recognition dawned slowly across her face, followed by genuine surprise and something that looked remarkably like pleasure. Aurora Baldwin? Rosie Goldberg set down her stamping device and came around the desk, her smile wider than any I'd received in months. My God, it's been ages. What brings you back to Millbrook? I'm looking for Thea, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Thea Davis. Does she still live on Elm Street? Rosie's expression shifted, became more careful. She does. Aurora, dear, are you all right? You look like I've been through something? I managed a smile. Because I have. Is she still teaching piano? Every day but Sunday. Has students from 3 counties now. Rosie moved closer, her voice dropping to librarian confidentiality. Aurora, Goldberg has talked about you over the years. More than once she's wondered. Wondered what? How you were. Whether you were happy? Rosie's eyes held a kindness I'd almost forgotten existed. She never forgot your friendship. The word friendship hit me like a physical blow. When had someone last used that word about me? When had I last been thought of as anything other than Curtis's mother? Clarice's inconvenience? The grandchildren's distant relative. Goldberg and I had been inseparable during the 2 years Jude was stationed at the nearby base before Curtis started school, before military life scattered us across the country like seeds in the wind. She'd been the one person who'd seen me as Aurora, not just as Jude's wife or Curtis's mother, but as a woman with thoughts and dreams and a wicked sense of humor that had been buried under decades of duty. Is she? I hesitated, suddenly afraid. 15 years was a long time. People changed, moved on, forgot. She's exactly the same, Rosie said softly. Go see her. She'll be so happy. The walk to Elm Street took me past the park where I'd pushed Curtis on swings while Goldberg played guitar and sang folk songs that made other mothers glance our way with barely concealed disapproval. We'd been young then, Goldberg barely 30, me 28, and still believing the world held infinite possibilities. The house looked smaller than I remembered. A pale yellow Victorian with a wraparound porch that sagged slightly on one corner. Wind chimes hung from the eaves, their soft music mixing with the sound of piano scales drifting through open windows. I stood at the gate for a full minute, suitcases at my feet, before gathering courage I'd forgotten I possessed, and walking up the flower-lined path. The music stopped when I knocked. Footsteps approached the door, slower than they'd once been, but still carrying that distinctive rhythm that had always announced Goldberg's approach. The door opened, and there she was. Older, certainly, her dark hair now silver, lines mapping stories around her eyes, but unmistakably Goldberg. She still wore flowing skirts and dangling earrings, still had paint under her fingernails from whatever art project currently occupied her kitchen table. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Goldberg's face transformed, breaking into the radiant smile I'd carried in my memory like a talisman through all the years of slow suffocation. Aurora. She said my name like a prayer, like coming home. Oh, honey, what took you so long? And then I was crying. Great, gulping sobs that came from somewhere deeper than grief, from a place where I'd been storing years of accumulated loneliness and the soul-deep exhaustion of being unwanted. Thea pulled me inside, her arms around me exactly as strong as I'd remembered, her voice making soothing sounds that required no words. The house smelled of lavender and lemon oil, of books and music, and the indefinable scent of a place where creativity lived and breathed. I didn't know where else to go, I finally managed, the words muffled against her shoulder. You came to exactly the right place, she said, pulling back to study my face with the intensity she'd once reserved for painting portraits. You look like you've been through a war. I have, and I lost. No, Goldberg's hands cupped my face, her thumbs brushing away tears. You won. You're here. She led me to the kitchen, where sunlight poured through windows lined with herb plants and student artwork. The table was covered with sheet music, colored pencils scattered among handwritten notes in the margins. Teaching keeps me honest, Goldberg said, following my gaze as she put the kettle on. 8-year-olds don't let you get away with anything less than your best. I sank into a chair that felt like it had been waiting for me. Goldberg, I should explain. Later. She waved a paint-stained hand. First, tea. Then you tell me what that son of yours has done to put that look in your eyes. The assumption that Curtis was involved should have surprised me, but Goldberg had always possessed an unsettling ability to read between lines I didn't know I was writing. The tea was chamomile with honey, served in mismatched cups that I recognized from our old Sunday afternoon conversations. Goldberg settled across from me, her attention complete and patient in a way I'd forgotten was possible. He wants to put me in a home, I said finally. Assisted living, they call it now. Clean, efficient, surrounded by people my own age who won't bother anyone. Goldberg's expression darkened. And you don't want to go. I don't need to go. I need to be needed. I need to matter to someone. The words came easier now, lubricated by tears and acceptance. But I've become inconvenient to their lives, an obligation they'd rather manage at arm's length. His wife? Clarice. She's efficient. Everything in their world runs according to her schedule, her priorities, her vision of what's appropriate. I stared into my tea, watching steam rise like the ghosts of better times. She's not cruel, exactly. Just completely indifferent to anyone who doesn't serve her immediate purposes. And Curtis goes along with it. Curtis has forgotten who he used to be. Or maybe I never really knew him at all. The admission tasted bitter. He's become someone who sees problems to be solved rather than people to be loved. Goldberg reached across the table, her fingers covering mine. Her hands were warm, steady, alive with the calluses of someone who still created beautiful things. What do you want, Aurora? Not what they want for you, not what's practical or convenient. What do you want? The question hung in the air like a challenge. When had someone last asked me what I wanted? When had my desires been considered worthy of consultation? I want to matter, I said finally. I want to wake up knowing that someone, somewhere, is glad I exist. Then stay. The simplicity of it stopped my breath. Goldberg, I can't just... Why not? I have 3 empty bedrooms upstairs. The mortgage was paid off years ago. I grow more vegetables than one person can eat, and I've been rattling around this house like a marble in a shoebox since Mom died. Goldberg's mother had lived with her until the end, I remembered. 93 years old and sharp as a tack, playing piano duets with her daughter until arthritis finally claimed her fingers. I won't be anyone's charity case, I said quietly. Good, because I'm not offering charity. Goldberg's smile held a hint of mischief. I'm offering partnership. You know what I've been needing? Someone to help with the business side of things. Someone smart enough to handle bookkeeping, organized enough to manage schedules, brave enough to deal with parents who think their tone-deaf children are the next Mozart. My heart stuttered. You're offering me a job? I'm offering you a life. A real one, where your intelligence and experience actually matter. Where you're Aurora, not just Curtis's mother or Jude's widow. Through the window, I could see a garden that needed tending, bird feeders that needed filling, a life that needed living. The afternoon light caught the dust motes dancing between us, and for the first time in years, I felt the stirring of something that might have been hope. My phone buzzed again, Curtis's name, demanding answers, expecting compliance. Without looking at the screen, I powered it off and set it aside. I'll need to get my things from storage, I heard myself say. And I should probably open my own bank account. Already thinking like a woman who owns her own life. Goldberg laughed, the sound bright as wind chimes. Aurora, you have no idea how much I've missed having someone to plan adventures with. Adventures. When had I last thought of life as an adventure rather than an endurance test? Outside, shadows were lengthening across the garden, painting everything in shades of gold and possibility. Somewhere across town, Curtis was probably calling Clarice, planning their next move in the chess game they thought we were playing. But I was no longer on the board they'd designed. I was writing new rules, in a place where I was wanted not managed, needed not warehoused. The thought should have terrified me. Instead, it felt like waking up after a very long, dreamless sleep. 3 weeks into my new life, I was kneeling in Goldberg's garden pulling weeds when the silver Mercedes pulled into the driveway. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. The engine's purr was as distinctive as Clarice's voice, smooth and expensive and faintly condescending even in mechanical form. Aurora. Curtis's voice carried across the yard with that carefully modulated tone he used in court. We need to talk. I continued working, my fingers methodically separating chickweed from the tender shoots of late summer vegetables. The tomatoes were heavy on the vine, their weight requiring the support stakes Goldberg and I had installed just yesterday. There was something deeply satisfying about the simple act of nurturing growing things, about being part of a cycle that created rather than consumed. Mom, please. Look at me. The please was new. In 21 days of ignored phone calls and unanswered texts, desperation had apparently worn down his certainty. I brushed soil from my hands and finally turned to face my son. Curtis looked older than his 39 years, stress carving premature lines around his eyes. His suit was wrinkled, unusual for someone who typically maintained courthouse-ready appearance even on weekends. Behind him, Clarice remained in the car, her phone pressed to her ear in a performance of being too busy to participate in family drama. You look well, he said, and I heard the surprise in his voice. I supposed I did. 3 weeks of Goldberg's cooking, of purposeful work, of conversations that challenged my mind rather than dismissed it. They had worked changes I could feel in my bones. The constant tension I'd carried in my shoulders had loosened. The perpetual knot in my stomach had dissolved. I slept deeply now, dreamless and restored. What do you want, Curtis? To understand what you think you're doing. The lawyer in him emerged, confident and prosecutorial. You disappeared without a word. You won't answer your phone. Do you have any idea how worried we've been? Worried about what, exactly? He gestured broadly at Goldberg's house, her garden, the life I was building. This, living with some stranger, making impulsive decisions. Mom, you're not thinking clearly. Goldberg isn't a stranger. She's my friend. A friend you haven't spoken to in 15 years. Whose fault is that? The question hung between us like a blade. I lost touch with everyone who mattered to me because maintaining your father's career, raising you, being the perfect military wife, it consumed everything. I let it consume everything. Curtis's jaw tightened. So this is about blame. You're punishing us because Dad's dead and you're lonely. The casual cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. Not because it was intentionally vicious. Curtis wasn't capable of that level of calculation, but because it revealed how fundamentally he misunderstood what had broken between us. I'm not punishing anyone, I said quietly. I'm saving myself. Goldberg appeared on the porch then, carrying a pitcher of iced tea and wearing an expression I remembered from our younger days. Politely curious about the drama unfolding in her garden, but prepared to intervene if necessary. Curtis, she called out, her voice carrying the particular tone teachers used with disruptive students. How lovely to see you again. You've grown up quite handsome. Would you like some tea? I watched my son struggle with the social niceties Goldberg's greeting demanded. He'd been raised to be polite to his elders, but his mission here required a different kind of authority. Ms. Davis. He managed a tight smile. Thank you, but we can't stay. I'm here to take my mother home. Home? Goldberg set the pitcher on the porch rail, her movements deliberately casual. Where would that be exactly? She has a house, responsibilities, a life to get back to. Had, I corrected. Past tense. I sold the house 2 weeks ago. Curtis went very still. You what? I called a realtor. The market's good for sellers right now, apparently. Mrs. Chen made an excellent offer, and I accepted. The closing is next Friday. You can't. He stopped himself, perhaps recognizing that he was about to say I couldn't make decisions about my own property. Mom, that's insane. Where will you live? I gestured toward Goldberg's house. Here. Goldberg has offered me a partnership in her teaching studio. I'll be handling the business side, scheduling, billing, correspondence with parents. It turns out I'm quite good at organizing things when it's for someone who actually appreciates my efforts. The color drained from Curtis's face. You're going into business? At your age? My age. I tasted the words, finding them less bitter than they'd once been. 62 isn't ancient, Curtis. It's experienced. Clarice chose that moment to emerge from the car, her heels clicking impatiently across the gravel. She wore a white sundress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, her hair styled in a way that suggested a standing appointment with professionals. How long is this going to take? She asked Curtis, not bothering to acknowledge either Goldberg or me. The contractors are meeting us at 4, and if we're late again... Clarice. Curtis's voice carried a warning, but she either didn't hear it or chose to ignore it. Aurora. This little tantrum has gone on long enough. We have plans for the renovation, and we need to know when you're coming back so we can schedule the moving truck for your things. I studied my daughter-in-law's face, looking for any trace of awareness that she'd just revealed the true purpose of their visit. The house sale had threatened their timeline, disrupted their carefully laid plans. What renovation? I asked. Clarice glanced at Curtis, who was staring at her with the expression of a man watching a carefully constructed case collapse in real time. The kitchen, Clarice said finally. We're expanding into the breakfast nook area. Curtis thought, we thought you'd want to know that the space will be put to good use. The breakfast nook where I'd eaten solitary meals for 8 years. The kitchen where I'd prepared countless dinners for grandchildren who increasingly had other plans, better places to be. You're renovating my house. The house you sold, Curtis said quickly. Mom, let's be reasonable. You can't have thought this through. Living with a stranger, starting some business venture. Goldberg isn't a stranger. My voice was steel now, honed sharp by weeks of remembered friendship and newfound purpose. She's someone who sees me as a person worth knowing, as someone with value beyond my utility to others. Of course you have value, Curtis said, his lawyer training kicking in. You're my mother. You're Warren and Angelica's grandmother. No one is questioning your value. Then why were you so eager to warehouse me? The question hung in the garden air, heavy with the weight of truth neither of us had been willing to speak aloud. Behind Curtis, Clarice checked her watch with elaborate impatience. I wasn't trying to warehouse you, Curtis said finally. I was trying to make sure you were safe, cared for, by strangers, for money, while you got on with your lives. While we all got on with our lives, yes. Mom, that's what people do. They grow up, move forward, build their own families, and abandon the people who built them. The words came out harsher than I'd intended, carrying years of accumulated hurt. Curtis flinched as if I'd struck him, and for a moment, I saw the boy he'd once been, uncertain, seeking approval, needing reassurance that he was loved. But that boy had grown into a man who confused love with management, who believed caring meant making decisions for people rather than with them. I never abandoned you, he said quietly. You just made it clear that I was no longer welcome in the life you were building. Goldberg had been silent throughout this exchange, but now she stepped forward, her presence somehow filling the space between us. Curtis, she said gently, when was the last time you asked your mother what she wanted? Not what was practical, not what made sense from your perspective, but what would make her happy. He stopped, confusion flickering across his features. When was the last time you spent an afternoon with her doing something she chose? When did you last ask about her dreams, her fears, her thoughts about anything that wasn't related to her health or living situation? The silence that followed was profound. In it, I could hear the weight of all the conversations we'd never had, all the moments when logistics had replaced intimacy, when management had substituted for love. She needed to be taken care of, Curtis said finally, but his voice had lost its certainty. She needed to be valued, Goldberg replied. There's a difference. Clarice's phone rang then, a sharp electronic intrusion that seemed to startle everyone back to the present moment. She answered without apology, walking back toward the car while discussing tile samples and delivery schedules. Curtis watched her go, his expression unreadable. When he turned back to me, something had shifted in his face, a crack in the armor of righteous certainty he'd worn since arriving. The kids have been asking about you, he said quietly. My heart stuttered. Warren and Angelica, now 8 and 10, had been casualties in this war I'd never meant to fight. Their absence from my life felt like a persistent ache, a phantom limb that throbbed with every milestone I missed. What do you tell them? That you're taking some time for yourself? And what do they say? Curtis's composure finally cracked, and I saw genuine pain in his eyes. They miss you. Angelica asked if she could write you a letter, but Clarice thought, what did Clarice think? That it might encourage you to drag this out longer. The casual revelation of how thoroughly Clarice controlled access to my grandchildren hit me like ice water. She wasn't just managing Curtis's relationship with me, she was managing theirs too. I see. I stood slowly, brushing soil from my knees. And what do you think, Curtis? He looked at me then, really looked, perhaps for the first time in months. I saw him take in the changes Goldberg had mentioned, the color in my cheeks, the straightness in my shoulders, the absence of the defeated posture I'd worn like a hair shirt for too long. I think, he said slowly, that I may have made some mistakes. It wasn't an apology, but it was recognition. A crack in the wall between us, narrow, but real. Yes, I said simply. You have. Clarice's voice rose from beside the car, discussing demolition schedules and permit applications. The sound of my old life being systematically erased, rebuilt according to someone else's vision. I should go, Curtis said, but he made no move toward the car. Yes, you should. He started to turn, then stopped. Mom, could we talk again? Soon? I considered the question, weighing the boy he'd been against the man he'd become, measuring the distance between recognition and change. When you're ready to listen, I said finally. Instead of managing, I'll be here. It was the most hope I could offer, and perhaps more than he deserved. But it was also a door left deliberately ajar, not an invitation to return to the old patterns, but a possibility for something new to grow between us, if he chose to tend it. October arrived in Millbrook like a gentle promise, painting the maple trees in shades of amber and crimson that reminded me why I'd once loved this season. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, and the piano studio had settled into the comfortable rhythm of a successful small business. I was updating the scheduling software when the call came. Not to my cell phone. I'd changed that number weeks ago. But to the studio's business line. Goldberg was teaching, her voice carrying through the French doors as she guided 8-year-old Oliver through a simplified Bach invention. Davis Piano Studio, this is Aurora speaking. Mrs. Baldwin? The voice was young, uncertain. This is Jasmine from Dr. Morrison's office. We have you listed as an emergency contact for Curtis Baldwin. My fingers tightened on the phone. Yes. Mr. Baldwin has been admitted to County General. The family is requesting your immediate presence. The words seemed to float in the air between us, disconnected from meaning. What happened? Heart attack, ma'am. He's stable now, but it was serious. Mrs. Baldwin specifically asked us to call you. Clarice had asked them to call me. The woman who'd spent 2 years orchestrating my exile from family life was now summoning me back because she needed something only I could provide. I'll be there, I heard myself say. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of autumn landscape and churning thoughts. 6 months ago, this call would have sent me into immediate panic, would have had me speeding through traffic with my heart in my throat. Now, I felt something more complex. Concern tempered by a hard-won understanding of my own worth. Love complicated by the memory of how easily that love had been discarded when it became inconvenient. Curtis was 39 years old. Too young for heart attacks, except that stress had a way of aging the body faster than time. And Curtis had always carried stress like armor, never learning to set it down. I found Clarice in the cardiac care waiting room, her usual polish cracked around the edges. Her hair was pulled back in a hasty ponytail, her designer clothes wrinkled from hours of hospital chairs. When she saw me, something flickered across her face. Relief, I thought, though it was quickly masked. Aurora. Thank God. She stood, her movements uncharacteristically jerky. The doctors want to speak with family, and there are decisions to make, and I don't know. She stopped herself, perhaps realizing that she was about to admit needing something from the woman she'd been so eager to institutionalize. Where are Warren and Angelica? With my parents. They don't know yet. I didn't know what to tell them. I studied her face, looking for the calculating woman who'd planned my removal from family life with such efficiency. Instead, I saw someone young and scared, facing a crisis that couldn't be managed with organizational skills and social positioning. Tell me what happened. Clarice sank back into her chair, her hands twisting in her lap. He collapsed at work, during a deposition. Just fell over. Her voice cracked slightly. They said it was massive. If it had happened anywhere else, if he'd been alone, the implication hung between us. Curtis could have died, and the last conversation between us had been that tense confrontation in Goldberg's garden, full of accusations and barely contained anger. Can I see him? The doctor wants to talk to you first. About his condition, about options. Options. The word carried weight that made my stomach clench. In medical settings, options usually meant choices no one wanted to make. Dr. Patel was younger than I'd expected, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the practiced calm of someone who delivered difficult news regularly. She led me to a small consultation room that smelled of antiseptic and institutional coffee. Your son suffered what we call a STEMI, ST elevation myocardial infarction, she began, her words measured and careful. It's serious, but he's responded well to treatment. We were able to restore blood flow to the affected area. Will he recover fully? That depends on several factors. His age works in his favor, but the damage was significant. He'll need surgery, bypass surgery, and a complete lifestyle change afterward. Stress management, diet modification, regular exercise, medication compliance. She paused, studying my face with the attention doctors reserved for family members who might become problems. Mrs. Baldwin, Clarice, mentioned that you and Curtis have been estranged recently. I need to be frank with you about something. I waited, my hands folded in my lap with a composure that surprised me. Your son's stress levels have been dangerously elevated for some time. His blood pressure, his cortisol indicators. Everything points to someone living under chronic severe stress. Recovery from this type of cardiac event requires significant life changes, and those changes are much more likely to succeed with strong family support. The implication was clear. Curtis needed me now in ways that went beyond emergency contact lists and hospital visits. He needed the kind of sustained, loving care that couldn't be outsourced or scheduled around convenience. "When can I see him?" Curtis looked smaller in the hospital bed, diminished by machines and tubes and the stark vulnerability of illness. His face was pale against the white pillows, his dark hair damp with perspiration. When his eyes opened and found mine, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. My son, not the lawyer or husband or father, but the boy who'd once needed me more than air. "Mom." The word came out hoarse, barely audible above the steady beeping of monitors. "I'm here." I moved closer to the bed, my hand finding his with automatic care. His fingers were cold, trembling slightly. When it happened, I thought about that day at Goldberg's house, about the things I said. His voice was weak but clear. "I thought that might be the last conversation we ever had. It doesn't have to be. Clarice told me you sold the house, that you're really staying in Millbrook." "I am." He closed his eyes, and I thought he might be drifting back into medicated sleep. But when he spoke again, his words carried the weight of true recognition. "I've been an awful son." The admission hung in the sterile air between us. 6 months ago, I might have rushed to reassure him, to minimize his failures and take responsibility for the breach between us. Now, I simply squeezed his hand and waited. "I let Clarice make decisions about you, about us, because it was easier than dealing with the conflict. I convinced myself it was practical, that I was being responsible." His eyes opened again, meeting mine with painful honesty. "But really, I was just taking the path that required the least from me." "Yes," I said simply. "You were." The starkness of my agreement seemed to surprise him. He'd expected absolution, perhaps, or the kind of maternal grace that forgave without acknowledging harm. "I don't know how to fix this." You start by wanting to fix it more than you want to avoid difficult conversations, more than you want to keep peace in your marriage or maintain the status quo. "Clarice is not evil, Mom. She's used to getting her way, and I was in her way." I kept my voice gentle but clear. "The question is whether you're willing to change that dynamic, or whether you'll choose the easier path again." Curtis was quiet for a long time, his breathing shallow but steady. When he spoke again, his voice carried a resolve I hadn't heard in years. "I want my children to know their grandmother. Really know her, not just see her on holidays when it's convenient. That's a start. Will you come back? Not to the old arrangement, but something new, something better." I studied his face, looking for the sincerity beneath years of accumulated disappointment. Recovery from this kind of crisis would take months, maybe years. The Curtis lying in this hospital bed might make promises that the healthy Curtis would find inconvenient to keep. "I'll help with your recovery," I said finally, "but I won't be moving back into the margins of your life. If I come back, it's as an equal partner in this family, not as someone to be managed or warehoused when I become inconvenient." "What does that mean practically?" "It means you and Clarice and I sit down and have honest conversations about expectations, boundaries, and respect. It means the children get to have relationships with me that aren't filtered through their mother's convenience. It means my voice matters in family decisions that affect me." Curtis nodded slowly, though I could see the effort it cost him. "And if Clarice can't accept those terms, then you'll have to decide what matters more to you. Your marriage as it currently exists, or having me in your life in a meaningful way." The monitor's beeping seemed to accelerate slightly, and I wondered if I was pushing too hard, too fast. But this conversation needed to happen now, while the reality of mortality was still fresh, while Curtis could still feel how close he'd come to losing everything that actually mattered. "I almost died today," he said quietly. "Yes, you did. And the last real conversation we had was an argument." "Yes, it was. I don't want to live that way anymore." The words carried the weight of genuine commitment, but I'd learned not to trust words alone. Actions would tell the real story, in the weeks and months ahead. A soft knock interrupted us. Clarice stood in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral. Behind her, I could see the silhouettes of 2 small figures. Warren and Angelica, still in their school clothes, their faces pinched with worry they didn't fully understand. The children wanted to see their father, Clarice said, her voice carrying a strange note I couldn't identify. And their grandmother. Warren broke free from Clarice's restraining hand and ran to my side, his 8-year-old arms wrapping around my waist with desperate force. Angelica followed more slowly, her 10-year-old dignity warring with her need for comfort. "Grandma," Warren whispered against my side. "Dad's sick and Mom said you might go away again." I looked up at Clarice, who had the grace to look uncomfortable. Even in crisis, she'd been planting seeds of uncertainty, maintaining her position as gatekeeper to family affection. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "Not unless your father decides he doesn't want me here." Curtis's eyes met mine over the children's heads, and in them I saw something I hadn't seen in years. The beginning of the man I'd hoped he'd become, finally ready to fight for what mattered. But whether that readiness would survive the transition from crisis back to ordinary life remained to be seen. Recovery, I was learning, was about much more than healing hearts. It was about rebuilding the relationships that made life worth living in the first place. Spring returned to Millbrook with tentative fingers, coaxing green shoots from the earth that Goldberg and I had carefully prepared through the long winter months. 8 months had passed since Curtis's heart attack, and the rhythm of our days had settled into something I'd never experienced before. A life built on mutual respect rather than obligation. I was teaching my first piano student when the doorbell rang. 7-year-old Betsy looked up from the keys with the solemn attention of someone who took her musical education very seriously. "Keep practicing that passage," I told her. "Remember, your left hand is the foundation. Everything else builds from there." Through the window, I could see Curtis standing on the porch, holding an envelope and looking remarkably like the uncertain boy who'd once brought home report cards that required explanation. 8 months of cardiac rehabilitation had changed him. Not just physically, though he was leaner and moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned his body's limits, but something deeper had shifted in his posture, his presence. Curtis. I opened the door, noting how he waited for invitation rather than assuming welcome. Small changes, but significant ones. "Mom, I'm sorry to interrupt your lesson. I can wait. Betsy's almost finished. Come in." He followed me into the kitchen, where afternoon sunlight painted everything in shades of gold and possibility. The house had evolved over the months into something uniquely ours. Goldberg's artistic sensibilities blended with my need for order, creating spaces that felt both creative and peaceful. "You look well," Curtis said, settling into the chair that had become his during his weekly visits. Another change. He came alone now, leaving Clarice to manage the children's activities without his constant oversight. "I am well." I poured coffee from the pot that stayed warm all afternoon, a luxury Goldberg and I had decided we deserved. "How are you feeling?" "Strong. Clearer than I've been in years." He accepted the coffee with the appreciation of someone who'd learned not to take simple pleasures for granted. "Dr. Patel says my numbers are excellent, better than they've been since my 20s. And Clarice?" The question hung between us with careful neutrality. In the months since his heart attack, the dynamic between Curtis and his wife had undergone seismic shifts that neither of them had fully navigated. "She's struggling with the changes," he said finally. "The therapy is helping, but it's hard for her to accept that the way we were living wasn't sustainable." Individual therapy for Curtis, couples counseling for both of them, requirements I'd insisted upon before agreeing to rebuild any relationship with them. Not out of vindictiveness, but from the hard-won understanding that words without behavioral change were merely performance. "And the children?" Curtis's face brightened, the way it always did when we talked about Warren and Angelica. "They're thriving. Warren asked if he could have his birthday party here this year. He wants to show his friends the piano studio and the garden." "What did you tell him?" "That it was your house and your decision." Another small revolution. For months now, Curtis had been consistently redirecting the children's request to me, rebuilding the direct relationship that Clarice had spent years intermediating. Betsy's practice ended with a flourish of slightly wrong notes, and I heard her gathering her music books with the satisfied rustle of lesson completed. Her mother would arrive soon, another small connection in the web of community Goldberg and I had built through the studio. "There's something I need to show you," Curtis said, sliding the envelope across the table. "Something I've been working on." Inside were legal documents, thick with the precise language Curtis wielded professionally. But as I read, I realized these weren't the kind of papers that built walls or managed problems. They were documents of restoration. "A trust," I said, looking up at him with surprise. "For Warren and Angelica's education, but administered by you. With your input on schools, activities, values, the kind of involvement grandparents should have." I continued reading, noting the careful provisions that guaranteed my voice in decisions about the children's upbringing, their exposure to art and music, and the things Goldberg and I had shown them during their weekend visits. "There's more," Curtis said quietly. "Keep reading." The final section took my breath away. A formal acknowledgement of my partnership in the piano studio, complete with legal protections and profit-sharing arrangements that went far beyond what Goldberg and I had casually agreed upon. "Curtis, this is overdue. You built something here, Mom. Something valuable and meaningful. It deserves the same legal protection as any other business venture." I set the papers down carefully, my hands not entirely steady. "Why now?" "Because I finally understand the difference between taking care of someone and honoring them." He leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "For years, I thought love meant solving problems, managing situations, making decisions for people I thought couldn't handle them themselves. But that's not love. That's control dressed up as concern." Through the kitchen window, I could see Goldberg in the garden, her silver hair catching sunlight as she tended the tomato seedlings we'd started in the greenhouse. At 64, she moved with the confident grace of someone who'd never doubted her right to take up space in the world. "What about Clarice?" Curtis was quiet for a long moment, his coffee growing cold between his hands. "Clarice is learning that being part of a family sometimes means sharing control, not just exercising it. The therapy is helping her understand why she needed to manage everyone around her, but understanding and changing aren't the same thing. And if she can't change, then I'll have to decide what kind of man I want to be, and what kind of father I want to be." His voice was steady, but I could see the cost of this clarity in the lines around his eyes. "I won't make the same mistake twice, Mom. I won't choose convenience over love again." The doorbell rang again. Betsy's mother, prompt as always. I excused myself to handle the transition, accepting payment and scheduling next week's lesson with the comfortable efficiency that had become second nature. When I returned to the kitchen, Curtis was standing by the window, watching Goldberg work in the garden with an expression I couldn't quite read. "She's remarkable," he said without turning around. "Goldberg. The way she's built this life, created this community. I can see why you chose to stay." "I didn't choose to stay, Curtis. I chose to live." He turned then, and I saw in his face the recognition of what that distinction meant. For too many years, I'd been existing rather than living, managing obligations rather than pursuing meaning. "I want to ask you something," he said, returning to his chair with the careful movement of someone still learning his physical limits. "And I want you to know you can say no without it affecting anything else we've built these past months." I waited, noting how he'd learned to speak directly rather than managing conversations toward predetermined outcomes. "Warren and Angelica want to spend the summer here. Not just weekends or visits, but the whole summer. They want to help with the garden, take advanced piano lessons, be part of what you and Goldberg have created." The request hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that went far beyond childcare arrangements. A summer with my grandchildren would mean Clarice relinquishing day-to-day control over their activities, their influences, their emerging sense of who they might become. What does Clarice think about this? Clarice thinks it would be good for them to experience a different way of living, to see what it means to build something meaningful from the ground up. He paused, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. She may have been more influenced by the therapy than she wants to admit. I thought of Warren's delight in the greenhouse, the way he'd carefully transplanted seedlings while asking endless questions about root systems and growing seasons, of Angelica's surprising aptitude for piano, her fingers finding melodies with the same intuitive grace her grandfather had possessed. "They'd have to follow house rules," I said finally. "Goldberg and I run a business here. There are expectations about behavior, respect for the space, contribution to the household. They'd love that. Structure with purpose instead of structure for its own sake. It was another recognition of how thoroughly Curtis was rethinking the values he'd inherited and passed on without examination. Clarice's household ran on schedules and activities that served social positioning rather than genuine development. There's something else, Curtis continued. Something I need to say, not as part of negotiating anything, but because it needs to be said. I settled back in my chair, recognizing the weight in his voice that preceded difficult truths. I was wrong about everything. About what you needed. About what family meant. About what it meant to honor the woman who raised me. His voice was steady but quiet, carrying the kind of certainty that came from months of painful self-examination. I treated you like a problem to be managed instead of a person to be cherished. I let someone else's discomfort with your presence override my responsibility to make sure you knew you were loved. The words I'd waited years to hear, finally spoken not in crisis or desperation, but from genuine understanding. I can't undo the damage I caused, he continued. I can't give you back the years when you felt unwanted, unwelcome in your own family. But I can make sure it never happens again. Outside, clouds were gathering for the afternoon shower that had become routine, the kind of gentle rain that nurtured without overwhelming. Goldberg had finished her gardening and was walking toward the house, her face bright with the satisfaction of work well done. The children can spend the summer, I said finally, but they'll need to understand that this isn't camp or childcare. They'll be part of our community, with all the responsibilities that entails. Curtis's relief was visible, but he didn't rush to thank me or negotiate details. He'd learned to let acceptance stand without embellishment. There's one more thing, I said, standing to meet Goldberg as she came through the back door, her hands dirty with earth and her eyes bright with curiosity about our visitor. What's that? You'll need to ask them yourself if this is what they want. Not just tell them it's been arranged, but listen to what they say and honor their choice. Curtis nodded, understanding that this too was part of the new dynamic we were building, one where even children's voices mattered in decisions that affected them. Goldberg joined us at the table, accepting coffee and bringing with her the scent of growing things and the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd spent the day in meaningful work. Planning the summer? She asked, reading the situation with the intuitive accuracy that had made her such a successful teacher. If the children want it, I said. Oh, they want it, Goldberg laughed. Warren asked me last week if he could live here permanently, said his friends at school wouldn't believe him when he told them about the greenhouse. The sound of our laughter filled the kitchen, mixing with afternoon light and the promise of summer rain. Outside, the garden waited for what we would plant, tend, and harvest together. Inside, the piano studio held the echo of music learned and teaching shared. I thought of the woman who'd sat in that other kitchen 8 months ago, packing suitcases with shaking hands and wondering where she could go. She'd been looking for shelter and found purpose. She'd been seeking acceptance and discovered her own worth. The thunder had passed, leaving the air clean and electric with possibility. What grew from here would be something entirely new, not a restoration of what had been broken, but the creation of something that had never existed before. Something built on the solid foundation of truth, watered with respect, and tended with the kind of love that honored rather than controlled. Something worth the wait. Now tell me, what would you have done if you were in my place? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to check out the video on your screen right now. I'm sure it will surprise you.